It is obvious to the most simple-minded that loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your argument strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Your engagement through like, share, and subscribe propels us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. This is Captain's Log. Stardate, February 13th, 2023. Iranian President Ibrahim Raeisi delivers a speech on the occasion of the 44th anniversary of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in the capital of Tehran. And the administration announces that the Iranian president will pay an official visit to China early next week at the invitation of his Chinese counterpart, amid the two Asian countries' strong determination to enhance strategic bilateral cooperation in various fields. At the invitation of President Xi Jinping, President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ibrahim Raeisi will pay a state visit to China from February 14th to the 16th. China's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying announced on Sunday. And during this 3-day stay, Raeisi, heading a high-ranking delegation, is scheduled to meet and hold multifaceted talks with the Chinese president. The two sides' delegations will also sign cooperation documents. The president will also attend the joint meeting of the Iranian and Chinese businessmen and visit with Iranian expatriates in China as well. Late last year, Chinese ambassador to Iran, Chang Hua, described China and Iran as old friends and new partners and expressed his country's eagerness to enhance all-out ties with the Islamic Republic. He said that China regards the relations with Iran from a strategic viewpoint and will not back off from the resolve to promote a comprehensive and strategic partnership with Iran, saying the two nations have opened a new chapter in their relations by starting a strategic partnership in 2016. Relations between Iran and China go as far back as the ancient Silk Road, but they're gaining strategic significance because of the West's refusal to work with Iran under U.S. pressure and its measures to clip China's wings and stop its economic and political rise. This is automatically pushing Tehran and Beijing into an alliance of sorts. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, American businesses have been prevented from trading with Iran, while their European counterparts have withdrawn amid the U.S. threats of sanctions. That has helped Chinese companies move in and fill the void. Yeah, so we mentioned, and we were thinking about the 80s and the Iran-Contra, the implementation of the Iran-Contra, and the 1970 Islamic Revolution was almost a reaction to the 1955 CIA coup of Mossadegh in Iran. So, yeah, the timeline is kind of has been explicated in a way today. 55, Mossadegh is overturned by CIA. 79, Islamic Revolution. 80s, Iran-Contra, and 90s Gulf War. 2000s, more of the same, according to Seymour Hersh and Uncle Hotep. And as a result, Iran and China have forged a unique partnership. It's almost impossible or not easily viable with any other country. China is still Iran's biggest oil client, despite Washington's bid to bring Tehran's exports down to zero. Iran's rail sector had become a magnet for rail engineering and rolling stock firms from all over the world before U.S. sanctions in 2018 forced them to withdraw. The pullout left the Chinese with a less contested business terrain. China's close involvement in the build-out of Iran's manufacturing infrastructure is seen entirely in line with its mammoth One Belt, One Road initiative. Iran and China signed a landmark 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement in March 2021 in defiance of unilateral sanctions by Washington. The deal officially documents the Sino-Iranian Comprehensive Strategic Partnership that had been announced during a visit by the Chinese president to Tehran in 2016. It sets the outlines of cooperation in political, cultural, security, defense, regional, and international domains for the next 25 years. And that, the concept of Iran and China coming together is closely related to a new shift as well between Iran and Russia. And Pepe Escobar, a wonderful journalist on Richard Medhurst's podcast, details this here.
Like it or not.
Pepe, you wrote an article, and I also talked about this link of SPFS. So that's the Russian alternative to SWIFT and
yes.
their messaging system, with the Iranian
yes.
one with Sepam.
Sepam,
yeah.
The Iranian one, right?
Isn't this explosive? Isn't this crazy?
It is. It is. It's so explosive, Richard, that you don't read a word about that in American mainstream media. And that proves. How explosive it is. This is the equivalent of blowing up Nord Stream 1 and 2, you know, in terms of alternative payments. Because this is the other players in Eurasia are going to be watching how the Russians and the Iranians are going to use this payment system for their trade using the international north-south transportation corridor, which is basically the anti-Suez Canal, Russia, Iran, India mechanism. Extremely, it's so serious, once again, that I'll have to go back to it. You don't read a line about that in American mainstream media. And you don't expect CNN to do a story about the international north-south transportation corridor, you know. And this is fantastic because now the Russians and the Iranians are investing on both sides.
And like, share, subscribe. You know, make sure that you disseminate this information to others. Very important. And there are constructs and powers that would rather us not know this. And I think it's important that we be open to, you know, all forms of knowledge.
The Russians are upgrading the port of Astrakhan, for instance, which is going to be their main Caspian hub to connect to Iran via the Caspian. The Iranians are upgrading their ports as well. They are upgrading railroads in Russia and in Iran connecting with the south of Iran, Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf of Oman, and then Arabian Sea, and then connecting to Mumbai in India. And the Indians are looking at that, of course. They have already their base, their port base in Iran, which is the port of Chabahar. And then because the Indians will be thinking in exporting to Iran, exporting to Russia, but also exporting to Central Asia, to Afghanistan and Central Asia via the port of Chabahar. So you have, for instance, a cargo ship coming from Mumbai. He docks at Chabahar. So he has merchandise that can stay in India, or stay in Iran, I'm sorry, can go to Russia, can go via highway to Afghanistan, and then to other nations in Central Asia. So India has its mini new Silk Road towards Central Asia via Iran. So everybody in this transportation corridor gets something out of it. It's a win-win-win-win-win situation for everybody. Now, for Russia, of course, because it's much easier for them to export to Iran and to India via the Indian Ocean. For Iran, obviously, because they'll be exporting north towards Russia, and then some other European nations, Eastern European nations as well, and also to India and South Asia. They can export to Bangladesh via India as well, even Pakistan. And Pakistan, of course, they will have to use Pakistani ports. That's another story. And this is an integration of the international north-south transportation corridor, the new Silk Roads, the Chinese, basically Belt and Road, the Chinese new Silk Roads in Iran, because they are not going to India, but they're going to Iran. And of course, they go through Russia, but they are under sanctions. So that decomplicates the Chinese as well, because the Chinese can even use the same thing. They can export via their maritime Silk Road to Iran, and then Iran distributes the merchandise via the Caspian to Russia and Russian satellites as well. So everybody is going to be profiting from this corridor. And that's why the payment system is important, because it's the first balloon. If it works in 1 year, other nations and other traders in the region are going to start using the same payment system, bypassing the U.S. dollar. Of course, not Dubai. Of course, Dubai is still SWIFT territory, and Dubai is still empire territory. So that's a completely different story.
It is, yeah. But I think it's incredible, because before we saw this kind of this merger of Mir with Union Pay, and then Iran was interested in it. Turkey expanded Mir payment, and then also Venezuela is interested in it. And this is really another step in that direction of uniting all of them. I think it's incredible.
Another step, Richard. Fascinated when I was in Uzbekistan, in the heartland of the Silk Road in summer, and every ATM accepted Union Pay and Mir cards. How fucking cool is that? You are in the middle of a road going to Samarkand. You go to an ATM and he accepts local Uzbek cards, Mir cards from Russia, and Union Pay from China.
That's crazy.
So you can see the new Silk Roads in your face.
Wow.
Payment system already working, For instance, Russian tourists visiting Uzbekistan in summer, no problem. They had their Mir cards. It's like they were in Russia. Same thing with there were not many Chinese, of course, because of COVID. But the few Chinese that they were traveling, they could use Union Pay everywhere. And soon we're going to see this all across Eurasia. We're gonna see it hopefully this year, if not this year, but next year. In Iran, you'll be able to until we're gonna see this all across Eurasia. We're gonna see it hopefully this year, if not this year, but next year. In Iran, you'll be able to pay with Mir cards and Union Pay cards, which until recently in Iran, of course, because you cannot use Visa and MasterCard, in Iran, you couldn't use any card at all. Now it's a completely different story. because and this is part of this integration, and it's part also the new Silk Roads. The Union Pay wants to be in the Iranian market. For them, it's excellent, and they can receive tourists from Iran as well traveling in China. And in Southeast Asia, of course, Southeast Asia, everywhere you go in Southeast Asia, you can use Union Pay, which was not, to give you an idea, all of you, it was not the case 5 or 6 years ago. Now everywhere you can buy. You want to buy some noodles in a shop in Thailand. You can pay with Union Pay or WeChat.
Yeah.
You know, you have your WeChat icon. There you go.
Great. So, yeah, just putting that into context, you know, the relationship between non-U.S. aligned countries, non-Western countries, and their financial ongoings and how they're connecting or disconnecting, and how that's affecting the Western countries as well.
With your permission, sir? Permission granted.
And we also have controversy over German foreign ministers. And the German foreign minister conceded war with Russia was a mistake. Particularly, and her name is Annalena Baerbock. She made an inflammatory statement, I would say, that the EU is at war with Russia. It was a claim that she made, and 1 month after, she has now admitted to her blunder. So Annalena Baerbock concedes the mistake after facing criticism from her own people. She's a German foreign minister. We'll listen in just a moment.
But the most important and the crucial part is that we do it together and that we do not do the blame game in Europe, because we are fighting a war against Russia and not against each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister.
And so here was the fallout from that statement, which, firstly, there was a huge reaction, but then just as of, let's say, 24 hours ago, she has retracted the statement. It was 48 hours ago. So German foreign minister admits being wrong when talking about war between West and Russia. German foreign minister Annalena Baerbock acknowledged on Saturday, after facing a wave of criticism in Berlin, that a recent statement about the West waging war against Russia and Ukraine was a mistake. German foreign minister Annalena Baerbock acknowledged on Saturday, after facing a wave of criticism in Berlin, that her recent statement about the West waging war against Russia and Ukraine was a mistake. Baerbock told a meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on January 24th that European countries wage war against Russia and urged them to do more for Ukraine instead of looking for the perpetrators among their own. The foreign minister's words were heavily criticized by German lawmakers, with some of them even calling for her resignation. There's a proverb saying that only those who don't live do not make mistakes. Baerbock told the Tagesspiegel newspaper when commenting on her own controversial statement I appreciate that she begins to philosophize, after declaring war. Would it be that, those who do not live do not make mistakes? Is the flip side of that, those who do live declare war? I think that would probably be. Yeah, let's listen in to Redacted.
Germans should heed the warning.
And this is on the 25th, so this is the reaction to that immediately after.
Of one of their most famous socialists, Karl Marx. I never thought I would quote Karl Marx here on the show, but maybe Germans should actually pay attention to one of their own. When Karl Marx, who famously said, "History repeats itself, first as a tragedy and second as a farce." Let that sink in for a minute, because I've heard this phrase many, many years. And it kind of creeps up, and it's one of those things where you kind of scratch your head a little bit. You think about this. History repeats itself, first as tragedy, second as farce.
Mm-hmm.
So the first time in war when we met, Russians, Germans, Russians destroyed Germany. We divide up Berlin into East and West. We crushed your army. Tens of millions of people died as a result of what Germany did.
Who's we in this instance?
I'm just saying the collective West, but of course the collective we being Russia in this scenario. I'm not saying we are Russians.
Russia is part of the West.
I'm just using it as a rhetorical sort of a narrative device.
Okay. I'm trying to follow you.
Yeah. So Russia loses. Russia is tens of millions of people, of course, die.
45 million.
45 million.
Yeah.
So 45, just a paltry, 45 million people die from what Germany decided to do. Now, the second time you repeat the same mistake, and what will happen to your country now? Will it become a farce? So what will happen when Russia decides to retaliate against a growing German threat? We're about to find out, because Germany just today openly declared war on Russia. This is
I think it's important to say, this is, I guess that could be said. We could agree with that. But also, her statement was that the EU, the entire European, she spoke on behalf of the entire European Union. So, note that.
A backroom conversation, some low-level peon, some low-level person. No. This is the German foreign minister. Oddly, speaking in English, this is Annalena Baerbock. Oddly speaking in English for all the world to hear, even though she was at the Euro Council meeting, which there's no English-speaking country represented at the Euro. So she's speaking in English, so we can all hear how she feels about
with Russia.
We are in a world war with Russia. We are at war with Russia. Not Ukraine is at war with Russia. We are at war with Russia. Those were her words. And this, of course, many Germans were quick to freak out about this, rightly so. Of course, we've seen a lot of protests across Germany saying down with this, absolutely not. And now they're calling for her immediate resignation. Will it happen? Of course not, because she's a stooge of the deep state. She's perfect for them. Russia responded saying, hey, the ball's in your court now. Want to keep escalating things because this is going to go nuclear. This, of course, is the same nut job who told Germans that she will put Ukraine first no matter what German voters think or how hard their lives get. Watch.
But if I give the promise to people in Ukraine, we stand with you as long as you need us, then I want to deliver, no matter what my German voters think, but I want to deliver to the people of Ukraine. And this is why, for me, it's important to be always very frank and clear. And this means every measure I'm taking, I have to be clear that this holds on as long as Ukraine needs me. We are facing now winter time where we will be challenged as democratic politicians. People will go on the street and say, we cannot pay our energy prices. And I will say, yes, I know, so we help you with social measures. But I don't want to say, okay, then we stop the sanctions against Russia. We will stand with Ukraine, and this means the sanction will stay also in wintertime, even if it gets really tough for politicians.
Yeah. So we don't care We don't care about you, citizens. It doesn't really matter. What we care about, of course, is Ukraine.
And she's making a unilateral statement. She's saying, I gave my word. This is what I want. Other people may not want it, but I like the idea of this, and I'm sticking with it. It's very self-centered.
Yeah. So screw you. It doesn't matter what, you can't pay your energy bills. We're sticking with Ukraine. My voters. I don't care. So Russia fired back. Of course, Putin's ally, Russian President Medvedev, invites Biden and Schultz to stop the doomsday clock ticking. Germans are outraged by this overall, of course. And here's a German response to this. So here's a German who says she has to immediately step down. It's one thing to support an allied country, which I guess is already a stretch of the term, but how could one be that irresponsible when choosing one's words? The most important thing to do is avoid a direct conflict, not to embrace it. German politician Marianne Harder-Kunel says this. Posted this, and the translation is, what Baerbock expresses here is a de facto war to Russia. In this war, she wants to pull all Europe in. She carelessly risks human lives. Whom does this woman serve? Not German or European interests, but U.S. geopolitics.
Bingo.
And of course, yes, bingo. That's the heart of it. That's the heart of it. What she's talking about, of course, is the new Leopard tanks being sent to Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that Germans would not send Leopard tanks to Ukraine because the people don't want us to do it, he said. But apparently the German people don't matter much to these politicians because Olaf Scholz has done an about-face and is now sending Leopard tanks. As he makes this announcement, he asks the German people to trust.
Here's a bit more on Baerbock.
At Moscow Institute of International Relations. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let's go to Martin J. in Marrakesh. What do you think of the foreign minister's words? Because she's gotten a lot of pushback for it, and it's called a gaffe, but we all know a gaffe is when someone tells the truth. It's not when they make a mistake. So she knew exactly what.
And just note, this is January 30th.
What she was doing. I would even go further, is that she may be making a play to become chancellor to push out Schultz. Anyway, Martin, your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think it's really interesting that Germany is so confused about the war. It just jumps from one camp to another. It started, if you remember, Schultz being very defiant and saying he wouldn't get involved, and sent a couple of containers of helmets to the Ukrainian army, which we all mocked and made fun of on the internet. But it does say a lot about Western democracy when a minister who just speaks the truth basically gets shot down. Forgive the metaphor. And people are asking for her to resign. I think that says an awful lot about where we are today with the truth and fiction. I always say the American war machine, or the American war business, because it is a business, wherever it goes in the world, it always has three doctrines: oversimplification, polarization, and disinformation. And I think the story now about Germany and the war, and this whole story about tanks, which is emerging, really fits this narrative completely. I think we're in a position now where it seems to me that the war of attrition that we've spoken about for so many days on this program is over. It seems to me that Western elites, particularly European governments, are almost pleading with their electorates, look, give us 6 more months. That's all we need. We just need 6 more months, because, the media have been thrown this bone with a lot of meat on it. Tanks, it's a great subject. The war has died down a bit because of the winter, so journalists need raw material to get their teeth into. We're going to see a lot of tank stories in the press in the next couple of months, and the media is going to obsess over the subject of this war is all about tanks. It's a single subject.
Yeah, thus the clip before coming out of the Baerbock story into the tank story.
It's a silver bullet. 6 months ago it was artillery, and now it's tanks. But I think tanks and the initiative from Germany, finally Schultz, who gave in, he's so weak. It's unbelievable how pathetic he is. Don't compare him to Hitler. Hitler was a strong leader. Schultz is completely weak. He's totally the opposite. But I think this story about tanks just raises the level higher from the height that you fall. What will we do? What will those elites do with their with the people who vote for them in 6 months' time when the tanks story isn't working for them, and they're being blown up. And people are starting to ask really questions. Well, how much are these tanks costing? Because in the UK now, pensioners are dying in their apartments. They're actually dying from hypothermia because they haven't got the money to put it into the gas meter, to heat themselves. And I think this is really part of the panic now that's setting in. We can't believe two stories. On the one hand, we were told that Western governments backing the Ukrainian forces were basically winning. Look at this ground that they've taken. But now, even Biden has been pulled into the tanks. Let's call it a black hole, because it really is a black hole to fall into. He's been,
Martin, let me go to Max here, because this focus on the tanks, for me, it's just a metaphor, okay? 30, 40, 50 tanks are not going to move the needle one way or another. As a matter of fact, it'll end up being quite humiliating, considering Russia's eyes in the sky. And I've been following on Telegram a few channels that show actually a very graphic video of the conflict. Watching those Abrams tanks melt is not going to be a good public relations spin, and I think they know that. We're going to send tanks, but they're not going to send them for a long time. Okay, Max, because for me it's more about the escalation ladder. This morning, I'm seeing reports that, now that we got the tanks out of the way, now I'm going to talk about F-16s, okay? This is the escalation, and Martin's absolutely right. It's a way to keep the Western publics interested, okay? Because I remember the lead up to the Iraq War, CNN just went graphics crazy. They never show any real destruction. They just show all these cool graphics, and that's what they're doing all over again, because this is an elite agenda. And they're trying desperately to get the public on board, and that's waning. Max, go ahead.
Well, I agree it's about escalation ladder. I also think it's about a certain shift in the resolve. We've heard today or yesterday one of the top NATO officials claiming that NATO is prepared for the war with Russia, which I think is an outcome of an assessment of NATO officers of their view of how Russia performs. But the matter of fact is that even though Russia has lost a significant number of conventional forces, the things that will most probably, God forbid, get involved in conflict with NATO has not been tackled, such as, nuclear arms, strategic aviation, other strategic arms, and things like this. So, and this is one of the, outcomes of this kind of wrong reading of the military history. My colleague brought up Hitler, and I have to say that Hitler misread the outcome of the Soviet-Finnish war, where the Soviets lost, and he thought that, the Soviets were too weak and that could be tackled. So I think right now NATO may be reading the lines wrongly here, and they believe that if they, pour more arms into Ukraine, Russia will suffer even more higher a blowback, and they will be dealt with easily. And I also would put it in a larger context and point to recent attack on Iran and rising escalation to China, which here in Moscow is read as part of the kind of Western strategy to go after the adversaries that have been put out there. Russia, China, and Iran is kind of part of the quote-unquote vicious axis of evil, new axis of evil. And that all is incredibly dangerous, and is, even if in the spring of last year, the U.S. in particular, the West in general, have pursued the strategy of the so-called boiling frog strategy, where they will, put up the heat gradually. Now they see the strategy hasn't really working, and Russia is still there, and is able to put up a fight. And they're, I think, in dire need, because, as my colleague mentioned correctly, in my view, the war of attrition has not really bore any positive fruit for the Western elites. So they're escalating much more quicker than they used to, with the tanks, with aviation and stuff, which unfortunately I think brings us even closer to the brink of a larger escalation and a much bigger war.
That's probably the intent here. One thing I'd like to point out to both of you, Baerbock's comments, as foolish as they were, that divided the West more. She's a divisive figure, but the same statement that she made, we unified Russians, because that was all over Russian television. See, they even said it. They're they're at war with us. Okay, we didn't want to go to war with them, but they're at war with us. I mean, it's really quite amazing how a slip of the tongue, so-called, can be used in a very different way, which nobody in Western media has even deigned to even comment on. Martin, okay. Another thing here. I mean, I just said, this escalation ladder. The problem with NATO and its mindset. I don't know what military thinkers they really have, because NATO's entire existence, it was most effective when it didn't do anything. That was our childhood, Martin. Okay, they didn't do anything; they were just there. Okay, but they crushed Serbia through air power. Serbia had no air power to respond. Okay, I don't even need to talk about the adventures in the Middle East. Goat herders with Kalashnikovs. Russia is not a goat herder with a Kalashnikov. Okay, it has eyes in the sky, very sophisticated aviation and aeronautics. Okay, NATO's never confronted this before because they never expected that they would. But they, through their own inability to think strategically about the Eurasian landmass, they've found themselves in this. This again is just more loose talk. I can't imagine they want to send F-16s to have them shot down. How many F-16s were shot down in Afghanistan? How many F-16s were shot down in Iraq? They will be shot down over Ukraine, Martin.
Yeah, and they're pretty expensive as well, and that's another issue that we should look at. Is that the money cannot continue? It just can't go on forever. F-16s are what, 60 million a pop. You can't sort of just write them off like that. It's interesting that you draw up this unsavory parallel with goat herders and AKs. It makes me think of Idlib a few years ago, where the Turkish army used Leopard 2 tanks in a particular town, and got surprised by the unwashed jihadists with their rusty AKs, who managed to blow up 10 of them. So it's an indication, and NATO should probably learn from that experience, that these tanks are very capable and they're very advanced. And I think if we just look at the bullet points on paper, they seem to be better than the Russian tanks. However, Ukraine is massive, and we know from the Idlib experience that these tanks won't operate very well in urban environments. So you're only looking at the countryside. Does that mean that then Russia focuses the war exclusively on the cities, and the Ukraine will then have to be forced to make the decision: do we send the tanks into these cities and risk huge losses? I think the tank story is a bit of a fantasy, and a lot of fake news has come with it. And I think NATO really, you talk about NATO and its role, and NATO really is about fake news. And I don't know how long that narrative can continue before people start, getting a bit tired of it.
That's the whole point. I mean, is that I've always said this, is that it's just the propaganda arm of U.S. foreign policy in Europe, okay? And then they began to believe their own propaganda about themselves. Russia wouldn't take on NATO. Oh my God, you told them they were at war with them. Let me go to Maxime here. I mean, from the Russian perspective, I mean, there's it's a military alliance, but what is it really made of? I mean, everybody's cobbling together these little outdated tanks, or the Belgians sell things that don't work for them, so let's give it to Ukraine. I mean, it's so embarrassing, considering their highfalutin rhetoric all the time based on values. But it's not backed up by much, is it? Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I think what another story that I think is overlooked right now in the West is that the Russian reading of this pressure over Germany to supply tanks is very much put in the context of kind of Anglo-Saxon geopolitics that has always pursued the idea to drive a wedge between the Germans and Russia in Europe, and you see the American discourse and narrative on this on the need for the Germany to supply tanks to Ukraine, where on the one hand, Americans are criticizing Germany for its impotence. They're saying, the German soldier is a civilian in a uniform, and Germany has been so lazy staying under the American umbrella, so they have to learn how to take care of their own security. And on the other hand, what they're doing is exactly linking Germany to U.S. military umbrella to an even greater extent.
Max, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with us. Security interests are, and they're getting away with it. They're actually succeeding. It's really quite amazing. I don't know how that's good for European security, which I doubt it is. Go ahead, Martin.
I don't know what's good for European security, but when we look at we go back to the beginning of the Ukraine war, what was, I think, prolifically worrying for many Western leaders was the rise of Germany's ability to rearm itself. The idea that Germany rearms itself to protect Europe is kind of hilarious if you think about it, and that's what, Schultz took that precedent. He took that moment to take advantage of the situation in the Ukraine war to rearm Germany for the first time. And I think that's quite worrying in its own. But what's also worrying,
I agree with you, but if I could just interrupt here. I mean, I've spent time in Germany during my entire adult life, many times. Very interesting country. I don't. Where are they getting into soldiers? Nobody wants to join the military. It's just not. Unless they get immigrants, which is something that could be very possible. I've always found it really interesting how Germany wants to have like Moldova in NATO, because they'll be the troops for NATO. And Germans don't want to do it. French don't want to do it. Italians don't want to do it. Okay.
Yeah, and also, don't forget
the umbrella of Germany being under the umbrella of the United States. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
You've also got to remember that the whole tank story is a logistical nightmare. I mean, I'm reading that the Ukrainians reckon that a soldiers can be trained in 10 weeks.
This guy is definitely, let me catch his name really quickly, because Martin J., I'm going to have to say, Maghreby.org. If he doesn't have some affiliation with the military-industrial complex, then that means he's totally subversive towards it and fighting against it. But in some way, he has a direct relationship to the military-industrial complex. That's for sure.
The Ukrainians reckon that the soldiers can be trained in 10 weeks to man a crew. Even if that's true, I mean, the Americans always talk about 20-week program for the Abrahams, but even if it's true, what sort of chance are they going to stand as being completely wet behind the ears going to battle against the experienced tank commanders on the Russian side? So I think the tanks is a fake news story, and I think we're going to see more of that. But what's worrying is Germany rearming itself, NATO being put in this position where the next really big decision that NATO will have to make a decision on is the most worrying one, which scares the hell out of me, which is that how do we crank this war up to the next level and keep the momentum going, keep media on our side, keep voters on our side? What worries me is that if these tanks have any impact, and they won't have any impact when you're talking about numbers of 30 or 40, but the hope is in something like 12 months' time, you might get to 200 to 300. If they start to have an impact against Russian forces, that puts Putin in a position where we are so horrified to think of what he can do next. Because if he's pushed in a position where he has to defend the Russian army against these onslaughts, then I think the next
step here, okay, and that's obviously a step in the escalation ladder here. What I find interesting about it is I don't know how meaningful the intent is. What they're doing is they're testing the waters to see what Russia's reaction would be, because it's putting, because Russia deems it is part of its sovereign territory. They've made it very clear that they will use whatever means necessary to protect their sovereignty. Obviously, we all know where this is going. It's kind of like, it's a very, very real life game of chicken here, Max.
Well, I think
corruption, and unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of Westerners are really going to the bank on this one too. I call it the Hunter Biden paradigm. But it's really interesting to me is that they were cleaning up corruption and all that. Well, it seems to me that what happened there is that so many greedy. There's so many greedy people around Zelensky that people want a greater cut. It's really very much like The Sopranos. Okay, I mean, I'm going to get my cut, and I'll cut this guy out, and because there's this funnel of money constantly coming in, people are seeing it, and I tend to think, and this is one of the reasons why I think that the kind of criminal mindset of the Zelensky regime is that they know this thing is going to be up. Is it going to be a month, a few months, a year? But they want their cut before it's cut off. Okay, and the tank story kind of covered, kind of pushed the corruption thing. Nobody really wants to talk about it. Though, right the day before the special military operation, Ukraine's a corrupt country. That's what most people knew. Now, we've seen over the last 11 months how narratives can easily change. Martin.
Yeah, they do. They do change a lot, but I think...
And so watch this space on this. This is journalism through the stars. It's illuminated from the oil of an proverbial olive tree, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. And with that, let's take a look at this story by Briahna Joy Gray of The Hill regarding the Twitter files and the author being slammed for bias reporting and for his search methodology. Let's detail.
What's on your radar, Bree?
Well, Robbie, from the first thread, the importance of the Twitter files has been clear to anyone paying attention. The first release, reported by independent journalist Matt Taibbi, detailed requests from powerful politicians and celebrities to delete tweets and have Twitter impose their censorious whims. And a pattern of requests from the Biden team were highlighted as especially pernicious. Although from that very first drop, Taibbi was clear that both the Trump White House and the Biden White House took advantage of what he described as tools for controlling speech. Taibbi was clear that the system was not balanced. As he wrote, it was based on contacts because Twitter was and is overwhelmingly staffed by people of one political orientation. There were more channels, more ways to complain, open to the left, well, to Democrats, than the right. This, according to Taibbi, resulted in a slant in content moderation decisions. And the most visible mistake made by Twitter was censoring the Hunter Biden laptop story as fake news, despite the fact that internal emails show that Twitter moderators did not believe the story violated Twitter's own guidelines. As I said, the significance of this reporting has been obvious to anyone paying attention. Not only was it a newsworthy story involving a presidential candidate's family suppressed in the lead up to a general election, additional Twitter file reporting revealed the following: that Twitter quietly assisted the Pentagon's covert PSYOP operations, that the pharmaceutical industry lobbied Twitter to shape content around vaccine policy, and that secret shadow banning of subversive accounts was rampant. But despite the newsworthiness of this reporting, many in mainstream media either ignored the Twitter files, dismissing it as a nothing burger, or they made ad hominem attacks against the journalists involved in an effort to undermine the relevance of their reporting. The reason for this political deflection seems obvious. As Matt Taibbi put it, the clear slant he observed in his review of the Twitter files was distinctly to the left. Liberals, inconvenienced by the revelation, simply had no interest in covering them. And they wonder why confidence in and viewership of liberal media is on the decline. Now, while I disagree with the calculated liberal disinterest in the Twitter files, I have had some concerns about the methodology used in the searches. The posture of the disclosure by Elon Musk is unique here. Typically whistleblowers have a more hostile relationship to their employers, and the documents they leak are confidently understood to be exposing some unpleasant fact about their employers, about the institution that they'd prefer the public not to know. In this case, then richest man on earth, Elon Musk, purchased Twitter after voicing concerns about freedom of expression on the app. He then used his position as CEO to make internal documents available to journalists of his choosing, and as the process went on, other journalists recommended to him by those journalists he had initially selected.
Emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
So he has an obvious interest in exposing the wrongdoing of his predecessors. Unlike a traditional whistleblower, however, he also has an interest in preserving the financial viability of his own multi-billion-dollar company. And as someone who has openly articulated a preference for conservative politics and whose personal brand is increasingly associated with more right-leaning public figures, he also has an obvious interest in making public those documents that confirm his perception that Twitter isn't just censorious, but that it has been targeting the right. Now, it's perfectly possible that that's the truth. I think Taibbi is obviously right that Twitter's staff and leadership has historically been left-leaning. And the obvious malfeasance with respect to the Hunter Biden laptop story seems to confirm that Twitter's biggest mistake was one that disadvantaged conservatives. And again, that's no nothing burger. At the same time, as a leftist, I have been curious whether the journalists have been as interested in running searches on the documents that might confirm what many on the left, who have been as or more antagonistic to the Democratic Party as Trump or Republicans, have felt. That Twitter is biased against all anti-establishment figures, including leftists. When asked, Taibbi, who identifies as left-leaning and in the past supported figures like Bernie Sanders, he said he honestly hasn't come across much in the way of left censorship. But a pattern of deplatforming and shadow banning of left figures that all of us have observed made it hard for many in the online left community to believe that. After all, it was Bernie supporters who were targeted by Hillary Clinton's Correct the Record troll farms that were funded to the tune of $1 million. They since became the K-Hive troll. Both right and left anti-war activists have been...
Well, let's pause for a second on that. Okay, so take a look at this. This is a quick taste of how an online troll army like Hillary's Correct the Record functions. We told you last month that Hillary, this is from May 17th, 2016. Let's see how this holds up in today's world, post COVID internet engagement. We told you last month that Hillary Clinton's super PAC Correct the Record, under the guidance of political hatchet man David Brock, was spending $1 million on an army of Twitter trolls. We got a taste of the digital stormtroopers in action when at least a couple of them colluded to get Bernie Sanders' Facebook pages shut down. But that may or may not have been an independent action, and it never represented the true tactics of the group called Barrier Breakers 2016, which would undoubtedly be far subtler and more insidious. This is so extremely like non-scientific and like quantitative. It's like, define subtle, especially relative to other subtle things, like far subtler, more insidious. You know, these are degrees that are subjective. Now, thanks to a keen-eyed Reddit user on the Sanders for President subreddit, we can pinpoint one of the nasty, shrewd tactics that are far more likely to Paste Magazine. That are far more likely to fly under the radar. The Redditor in question noticed a very specific phrase that had been repeated twice by different users, which you can see in this image: the anti-Hillary hyperbole on S4P. The two elements we see here can only exist in tandem. The claim that anti-Hillary hyperbole on S4P is often unreal, and the insistence that the poster is a Sanders supporter, lending legitimacy to the complaint. Well, maybe Sanders supporters agree on something. It's the word-for-word language, of course. I mean, it's just for a sec. Can we for a sec?
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
The whole notion of logic.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. It's the word-for-word language, of course, that indicates concerned trolling on an organized level, rather than just the individual hand-wringing each user is trying to convey. As a follow-up, the Reddit user ran a Google search for those specific words, and the results are either funny or horrifying, depending on your perspective. What were the results? The trolling will likely become less sloppy and less identifiable as time goes on, but it's this kind of strategy that muddies the digital waters and makes it hard to trust any source, which when you're the candidate with far less representation on the internet might be exactly what you want. Now, even further than that, who's to say, and maybe I'm wrong, is trolling in some way innately untrue? I don't know, maybe we should continue to think about that.
Swarmed by pro-Ukraine, Nazi-affiliated NAFO trolls who made memes, including the N-word and cotton fields, that filled my mentions for days after I interviewed and disagreed with a pro-intervention guest on my podcast. And given the left's understanding of how power works, that there is a bipartisan...
Yeah, so, I mean, essentially they're not trolls, right? They're just people, they're groups, they're sects that have disagreements with the powers that are in the position to label them trolls.
And corporate consensus that weaponizes its power to extract wealth from the working class and thwart populist movements at any cost. I felt suspicious that the coverage was so one-sided. And given my experience conducting document review processes as a corporate lawyer for 6 years, I was also more skeptical about the document disclosure process than the journalists involved in the Twitter files seemed to be. You see, one of the key tasks corporate lawyers engage in, at least junior associates like myself, was to comb through thousands and thousands of documents that might expose your client legally. You are required to turn over documents in the context of a lawsuit that are responsive to specific document requests made by your opposing counsel. There are some exceptions to what you have to disclose, including privileged communications between clients and their attorneys. But much of the litigation process is consumed with debates over what each side can fairly request and whether they can exclude other kinds of documents. For example, can we exclude various date ranges, or can we exclude personal emails? Can you filter out emails that include a personal email like a Gmail address? Or is there a case to be made that because a client sometimes emailed things to their Gmail, you can't actually exclude all personal email? Is the client searching their entire document database? Were files deleted in anticipation of litigation? I mean, there's a whole industry built up around document forensics to ensure that corporations don't lose legal loopholes to withhold documents that could provide evidence of their own wrongdoing. So, when I hear the Twitter Files journalists say that they're confident they were able to search everything because the search results they requested were returned to them very quickly, too quickly to say filter out inconvenient documents, I gotta say it strikes me as somewhat naive. On a recent episode of my podcast, even attorney Glenn Greenwald expressed some hesitation about the process, saying that he probably would not have felt totally comfortable, to be honest, with the way the Twitter files were done, because he's not willing to be manipulated by the possibility that people are handpicking what they want him to see or don't want him to see.
I probably would not have felt totally comfortable, to be honest, with the way in which it was done. In the sense that they were the guardians of the information, and the only information that you end up getting is information they decide to give you. And I'm not willing to kind of be manipulated by the possibility that people are handpicking what they want me to see or don't want me to see, because that can end up causing me or putting me in the position where I'm unwittingly serving as a spokesperson for an agenda that is not mine.
We have the
all
evidence.
Right, so all of
can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
This buildup brings me to the ongoing hearings on the Twitter files. Initiated by Republicans who are now in control of the House, the intent of the hearings was ostensibly to force the public to pay attention to what I agree has been important reporting and to reckon with the liberal bias at play on social media sites. But the hearings took a somewhat different turn. Testimony revealed that the Trump administration routinely asked Twitter to take down posts they objected to, including a tweet from way too online model Chrissy Teigen, in which she called Trump, well, I'll just play the clip for you.
On September 8th, 2019 at 11:11 p.m. Donald Trump heckled two celebrities on Twitter, John Legend and his wife Chrissy Teigen, and referred to them as the musician John Legend and his filthy-mouthed wife, unquote. Ms. Teigen responded to that email at 12:17 a.m., and according to notes from a conversation with you, Ms. Navaroli's counsel, your counsel, the White House almost immediately thereafter contacted Twitter to demand the tweet be taken down. Is that accurate?
Thank you for the question. In my role, I was not responsible for receiving any sort of request from the government. However, what I was privy to was my supervisors letting us know that we had received something along those lines or something of a request. In that particular instance, I do remember hearing that we had received a request from the White House to make sure that we evaluated this tweet and that they wanted it to come down because it was a derogatory statement directed to the president.
They wanted it to come down. Legend and his wife Chrissy Teigen, and referred to them as the musician John Legend and his filthy-mouthed wife, unquote. Ms. Teigen responded to that email at 12:17 a.m., and according to notes from a conversation with you, Ms. Navaroli's counsel, your counsel, the White House almost immediately thereafter contacted Twitter to demand the tweet be taken down. Is that accurate?
Thank you for the question. In my role, I was not responsible for receiving any sort of request from the government. However, what I was privy to was my supervisors letting us know that we had received something along those lines or something of a request. In that particular instance, I do remember hearing that we had received a request from the White House to make sure that we evaluated this tweet and that they wanted it to come down because it was a derogatory statement directed towards the president.
They wanted it to come down. They made that request.
To my recollection, yes.
I thought that was an inappropriate action by a government official, let alone the White House. But it wasn't Joe Biden about his son's laptop. It was Donald Trump because he didn't like what Chrissy Teigen had to say about him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
My.
Yeah, I can't. I can't repeat what Chrissy Teigen tweeted, but imagine grab him by the blank, followed by a synonym for tookus, followed by a word for a female dog. As one former aide to a senior Trump administration official told Rolling Stone, it was strange to see when all of these investigations were announced because it was all about the exact same stuff we had done when Trump was in office. Per the Rolling Stone, in interviews with former Twitter personnel, one-time Trump administration officials, and other people familiar with the matter, each source recalled what could be described as a hotline or tip line or large Twitter database of moderation and removal requests that was frequently pinged by the offices of powerful Democrats and Republicans alike. Now, to be clear, the secret censorship by the government exacted via social media accounts is an issue no matter what party is doing it. I'm not as dismissive as the man in that clip was about how, well, we're harping on the Hunter Biden laptops. The Hunter Biden laptop was important. But it's worth asking whether Twitter Files journalists were sufficiently skeptical of Elon's motives and disclosures, and whether in exposing legitimate truths via their reporting, they were also useful idiots for Elon's own political project. Should they have asked more questions about their access to the files and whether it was truly comprehensive? Lawyers who withhold documents in a legal context often must produce what are called document logs, detailing what is in the documents that they are not disclosing, so the other side has a chance to contest the legitimacy of those non-disclosures.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Any vetting of Elon's document searches or any understanding of what he might have withheld that is inconvenient to the narrative that the Twitter censorship disproportionately hurt the right? Now, Taibbi's response at the congressional hearings has been somewhat flip. He tweeted that there's nothing new here, that in the first Twitter files dumps, he reported that there have been requests from the Trump White House, and that he showed that agencies like the FBI sent spreadsheets with thousands of names to block at a time. And look, Taibbi's absolutely right. He did disclose that in one of the first tweets in the first Twitter files thread. But Matt's framing of the Twitter files has clearly indicated that Twitter influence was disproportionately from the left. And while he reported that the Trump administration has made censorship requests, he didn't really detail those requests at the same level of detail he spent describing the Biden administration's request. Listen to him describe his search methodology and the results here in this clip.
A lot of people have been critical of the Twitter files in this project because they think that we're quote unquote cherry picking or showing only one side of things. Just to give you an example of how this worked, like I ran searches for Yoel Roth, the lawyer Stasha Cardile, who it turns out I think it feels like she was running the company. Like everybody seems to be deferring to her, even lawyers technically ahead of her. There was a policy director named Lauren Culbertson. So I picked all the senior officials, and then I ran a search for DNC and RNC, right? On the off chance that there were also requests coming in from the RNC to get rid of stupid pages, and it didn't turn up that. Like what you get from the DNC is just this pile of requests to get rid of mostly really stupid things, like, you know, people saying hey, Republicans, go out and vote on Wednesday or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
But you know, occasionally it's something like this where it's legitimately a parody, and they have to take their time out and explain to the DNC that, you know, we don't do that. You know, this is like speech, and they're not understanding that. On the RNC side, I'm not seeing it. Instead, what you see from the RNC are these constant letters saying, we're going to sue you if you keep doing this kind of stuff to us. So in other words, whether it's because the Republicans didn't think they would get away with it if they wrote to Twitter, or whether it's because there was a genuine difference in how they viewed this kind of thing, there just wasn't, you know, a flip side to the story where you're seeing similarly stupid stuff coming from the Republican side.
So on one hand, Democrats are making document requests. On the other hand, Republicans are threatening to sue if they don't pull down. Make censorship requests, rather. On the other hand, Republicans are threatening to sue if they don't censor certain documents. Is that really a meaningful difference? Moreover, I have some other concerns. His search terms, as he described them there, are clearly flawed. It could be that emails from left-leaning Democratic officials that wanted to censor tweets were directed through the DNC and therefore turned up when he did a DNC search. But if Republican requests weren't centralized through the RNC, say they came directly from the Trump administration, then the term RNC simply wouldn't turn up hits. Look, designing comprehensive search terms designing comprehensive search terms is a legitimately difficult task. It was one that I was paid a significant sum to carry out for years as a corporate lawyer. So I by no means mean to beat up on Matt for perhaps doing so inartfully. But between unsophisticated search criteria and the lack of transparency around what document trove these searches are actually even being applied to in the first place, I think it's somewhat irresponsible to make, at this stage, such strong claims about the political bias that's allegedly proved by the Twitter files. As one Twitter user wrote in response to Matt Taibbi after yesterday's hearings, they gave you some information, held from you a lot of information, then you proceeded as if you had unfettered access and wrote what now seems as a highly subjective account. I think they pulled one on you, to be honest. And in response to criticism that he should have reported on the Teigen request specifically, the Chrissy Teigen request, Taibbi responded, "I didn't see it and don't have it. I was, however, told by sources there had been requests from the Trump White House, which I reported even though I didn't have the actual text." Okay, but reporting credulously on just a piece of information fed to you by an obviously self-interested CEO, that's exactly the problem. That's exactly the problem that Glenn Greenwald identified when I asked him whether or not he would be willing to act as one of the Twitter Files journalists and why he expressed some skepticism about his willingness to do so. To be clear, I fully believe it's likely that Twitter has a liberal bias. But I also think the most important part of this story is that the rich and powerful are able to censor the rest of us, regardless of what their political orientation is or what ours is. Unfortunately, it's not clear to me that that's also Elon Musk's priority. And I hope that going forward, given the importance of this reporting, that the Twitter Files journalists are keyed into the possibility that Elon's interests as CEO of Twitter and their interests as investigative reporters do not perfectly align.
There we have it. And remember, your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. I'm going to open a channel.
We have the evidence.